All right, so day 9, we are moving into the lumbo-pelvic-hip complex. So really what we're talking about is the core, right? Like if we're talking about the core, you know, we're talking about like the sort of like global version of the core, right? Like a lot of people think of the core, they think of the abs, right? Like they think of like the six pack, and that's not necessarily wrong because it's part of the core, but it's certainly not the only part of it. Your entire lumbo-pelvic hip complex, that's really what your core is. It's all of it, right? So that's really what we're going to be diving into today. We're going to be looking at all of these sort of individual pieces, anything and everything that is attached to your spine and pelvis. So breaking this down, if we're giving these like little pieces here, the lumbo-pelvic hip complex is any of the anatomic structures of the lumbar spine, so it's your low back. Your thoracic spine is still part of this as well, so like your upper back. So really we're just looking through the spine there. The pelvic girdle, that's your actual like pelvis. Those two pelvic bones coming together on either side. And then the hip joint, which is where most of our actual movement occurs, right? That ball and socket joint right there. Again, ball and socket joints are the most mobile, so we got the most type of movements we can make here. So those are the areas we're talking about. So if we're looking at the lumbar spine, right, this is the portion of the back we consider like the small of your back, right, the little blue section right here. And you can see it's going to be these 5 discs, right? This is your L1, L2, L3, L4, and L5. A lot of our clients deal with problems in like the L4, L5 area. That's where we see like a lot of like disc herniations and bulges and things like that. So because those are sort of the 2 most common, and that makes sense when you think about it, because you're like, oh, okay, well, that's, I mean, all of the body weight is coming down and it's between this like big hard foundation here. It would make sense that the things at the bottom are the ones that get the most torn. But obviously you could experience herniation literally in any disc that has, nuclear material between it. Those little, those are those little sponges in between the bones, those are the discs. So the lumbar portion is that lower section, and it is where also like you get that lumbar curve, right? It's like this S shape. It goes from here and then kind of bulges out this way, and then because of that it has to swing back in the other direction to make sure that it's maintaining balance. Again, kind of like a Jenga stack, right? Like if you pull a block from the left, you got to put it on the right. And that's what we're going to see in that section. We got the thoracic spine. This is your T1 through 12. So 1, 2, 3, all the way down to 12. That is basically your upper back or mid torso. And so that is, we don't usually think of that too often when we think of like the core, but it certainly is part of it, right? I mean, like even if you look at your abdominals here, which would, tie all the way up to about here, that's even the lowest portion of your thoracic vertebrae there. But that area can also experience like aches and pains. It's a little less common just because those discs are very large, and there's not a lot of like stressful forces that happen between the mid back. So usually there's not a lot of common damage in this area. It's not frequently injured, but certainly could be. And then we get your pelvic girdle. That is going to be what is called your acetabulum. You'll hear that term sometimes. The acetabulum is like the entire girdle, because technically these are 2 like separate. I mean, actually, technically they're 3 bones kind of fused together on each side, so 6 really. But again, it kind of depends on who you ask. But you can see there's sort of like these different portions of it, right? And so you can see like the 2 sides. This is your what's called your ilium, and then this is your other ilium, right? And so where those 2 kind of come together, that's your actual pelvic girdle, and that's the acetabulum is the big fancy name we give it. And then what holds the acetabulum together is that little triangle shaped bone right here. That's your sacrum, which is a bunch of bones fused together. And then you've got your coccyx at the very bottom there, which is another, kind of one of our just like remnant pieces. That's what's left of our tails as we sort of grew out of that. And then it does give some certain muscles like a little bit of, mechanical advantage and stuff. But for the most part is just kind of vestigial, but that's that is the two sides of our pelvic girdle there, right? That's the two sides of that, and we're moving that around, right? This is remember, this is not necessarily like a synovial joint. This isn't meant to move like a lot, but the hip joint certainly is. And so that's actually the reason it's sort of designed that way, right? Like we got this thing that can move lots attached to something that really isn't supposed to move all that often. And that's good because it gives it stability, right? Because we know that with increased mobility comes decreased stability. You know, oftentimes the stuff that we dislocate is the stuff that we can also move the most. And then we got the hip joint, right? And the actual hip joint is that ball and socket joint where your femur is inserting. So lots of range of motion, lots of movement that can happen there. That's called your acetabulo-femoral joint, which is like so freaking hard to say, but it's your hip joint. That's what we're going to call it. But that is where all of that is sort of inserting. And again, ball and socket, right? Ball and socket, super, 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 super mobile. Which is why you can see these, you can't see it in this picture here, but like these really big, super thick ligaments that kind of wrap around the entire area. And that's really important, you know? Definitely a joint we do not want to dislocate or tear any of those ligaments in, but you know, sometimes it happens. If we're talking about the lumbo-pelvic-hip complex has between 29 and 35 muscles that are attached to it. We're going to be a little bit more simplified than that in the way that we break it down. Again, this is like one of those things where it's like, how many muscles are in the body? And it's like, nobody can agree. You know, like me, I think that they should just consider the long head and the short head of the biceps. They're totally different muscles, you know, like, but other people are like, no, they share fibers, therefore they're one muscle. It's like, all right, whatever. But yeah, between 29 and 35 is what you're typically going to see. We're not going to have to memorize that many. But we can understand like the complexity here. That's really why we're saying this, right? It's like, oh, that's a lot of muscles. And then like a lot of little tiny bones, like the discs are very complicated. So it makes sense that like dysfunction's very common. Remember I mentioned that like lateral ankle sprains, most common like sports injury. Well, the most common injury that literally most people will deal with in their life is chronic low back pain. About 80% of the population will have chronic low back pain at some point in their life. And when I say chronic, I mean like it lasts about 6 weeks or, you know, oftentimes years. So, you know, I definitely have a little bit of this myself. Like I have a little bit of like spinal stenosis that runs in my family, which is basically, it's not one of our common injuries that we're talking about today, but stenosis is basically where if you look at your spinal discs, they basically get like a little bit of like extra tissue. So you can see like the nerve is going to run through that portion of the disc there. And you can see like that canal, there's a lot of like black empty space, but in this version here, there's not, right? That's kind of what spinal stenosis is. For some reason, my body loves to be like, oh, you need some more bone on the spine? Yeah, here you go. And it just more and more and more. And so now the canal is a little bit more narrow than it should be. And when that happens, like whenever you touch a nerve, right, you get little aches and pains. So that's really common in my family. My mom, actually, and my grandpa as well, her dad, and who knows, this could happen to me someday, got so much extra calcium on their disc that one day my mom she was working at the pet store. So I turned around to like bag up a customer, and all that calcium broke, and it broke 4 of her discs with it. Oh, luckily, it didn't sever the nerves, so she wasn't paralyzed, but it did lead to like a lot of pain. I used to have to help my mom put her socks and shoes on every day. Like it was a whole thing, you know? And now, you know, she went and got the surgery that she needed for a long time. She's actually pretty mobile at this point. But like very common, you know, low back pain, very, very, very common. And that runs in my side, yeah, that runs in me as well. Which is why I move as much as I do, you know, by being like physically active, I'm less likely to, you know, the real reason that that happened is because like, yeah, my mom was active, like working all day, you know, up and down the store, moving things, taking care of pets and stuff. But like, she's a very naturally sedentary person. My mom's a little bit of a couch potato. Like if she's gonna do her favorite thing, all of her favorite activities are, she loves watching really good movies. She loves, like reading, like just very sedentary stuff. That's kind of her natural sort of like default setting. So when that happens, that calcium has a chance to kind of embed itself in and harden, and she doesn't move around enough. So yeah, so that's really common, right? Not stenosis. Stenosis isn't that common, but like low back pain certainly is, because there's also just a lot of different types of low back pain, lots of different types of injuries that can happen there. So more than about a third of all work-related injuries usually involve the trunk, usually the low back, like I said, about 60% of them. But here's the thing, the economic burden of all this, $26 billion a year, right? It's a crazy, crazy, crazy amount of money. And when I say like, it costs 26 billion, that's like money that, everyone is like losing to like healthcare bills, you could have like great insurance, but like even then, like you're still going to have to pay like something out of pocket. And it's a burden, people ask me all the time that, like, sometimes I would tell people the resort that I worked at, by the way, it was like $2,000 a week. It's a crazy amount of money. And people are like, how could people afford that? And honestly, when I think about it, a lot of people, they would just come for a week and they would get like these lessons and these lectures, and they would get an idea of like what it was like to work out, and they would gain the confidence. They would go home and carry all that. They'd build connections with us, and we would like be able to teach them how to do it again later, and it would change their life. They'd go home. And I would say, how can you afford not to? Because a heart attack is way more expensive. Low back pain is way more expensive. I mean, it's not costing me $26 billion, but like, it's costing all of us like a lot of money. So
yeah,
that's why, that's why, sometimes I just don't know how people can afford a gym membership. And it's like, I don't know how people can afford not to, like totally different,
Good perspective.
yeah, it's keep it in the brain,
I'll definitely mention that to my future clients.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
Like you have all these debts, all this like freaking surgery and injury stuff, but you don't have enough money to pay a gym membership.
Yeah. That's the other thing, is like, I also tell people, I'm like, my parents are like this. They're like, we bought this new liquid vitamin that's all special. It's supposed to give all you. And I'm like, vegetables are so much cheaper, like, or like, go hire a trainer. I'm like, you are killing me. My parents, I'll talk about this a lot, actually. My parents are great examples for a lot of things. My parents are a great example of a lot of like what our clients are like. They are magic pill people. Like, they're totally like silver bullet people, like they want
like
that infomercial, like 6 payments of $14.99 and it'll solve all your life's problems.
Yeah, I think that's how every parent is, to be honest.
So, yeah. All right, so we've also got sacroiliac dysfunction. This is a pretty common one as well. This is SI pain. Man, I had really bad SI pain earlier, like last year. But sacroiliac dysfunction is either too much or too little movement in that sacral joint right there. And so again, like, you've got your tailbone down here, and then you've got your sacrum, which holds these two bones together. And it's not really meant to move very much. This is not a synovial joint. This is a cartilaginous joint. So it's designed to do a little bit of movement, but not a lot. And so when it can do a lot of movement, it's pulling on things that really are not supposed to move. Or when it can't do any movement, that's going to cause, like, again, like grinding and aches and pains. So oftentimes you'll see like the hips will become sort of offset from one another. You'll see one will sort of get elevated and one will drop down, or maybe one will rotate and one won't. That happened to me last year. I took like a really bad hit. We at like my frisbee game, like just a really, unlucky play. And I remember being like, it kind of hurt, and got up, kept playing. And when I cooled down, I was like, man, my back is killing me. And I started having, and then like, I was like, oh, my hip is killing me. And I went to the chiropractor like over, and I'm not a fan of chiropractors personally. I went over and over and over again. And he was like, yeah, man. He's like, you popped one of your sacrums like out of alignment. And so basically like one had rotated forward and it was just locked in this position here. I saw this physical therapist over in Van Nuys. He was an ex like physical therapist for the Raiders. So he was like a big football player dealing with guy. And he was like, Robert, you'll remember all this. I was talking about this every day in class back in the day, but like he would literally like just like people's elbow, like way up, like trying to like get my hip back in place. And he just couldn't do it. He was like, he's like, you are a skinny dude and I cannot get this bone back in place. I was like, I don't know, man. So I ended up taking like my roommate ended up getting back pain and he had an extra muscle relaxer. So I like took one of those and I like went in and I was like, now's the time. And he was like, thunk. And sure enough, like I was like, oh, and it was like instant relief. And I just like knocked this whole thing out of alignment. It was such a pain in the rear, literally. So that's sacroiliac dysfunction. And that can also just happen. Like it happened to me, it was very traumatic, right? It was like a contact injury, but it can happen just by tightening up slowly over time. This is one of the reasons why I tell people do not keep your wallet in your back pocket. I know that like, you know, at least don't sit on it when it's in your back pocket. Because it elevates one of your hips and you end up like this, and that literally will tighten up one side and loosen up the other. SI pain.
That totally makes sense. I drove from Mexico to Las Vegas. Ooh. And I was like, you know, I don't know. I didn't
wallet
at first. Yeah. And then I got out of my car and I was like, Jesus, like I couldn't even move.
Yeah, I'll bet. Oh, that sucks.
It was horrible.
Yeah. I'm like a leg tucker naturally too. I love to tuck one leg under my hips. I'm like, that's so bad for you. Don't do it. In fact, yeah, here. You know, I'm just gonna see this. Yeah, this classic, like, you know, even like this lady here. You know, she's right. It goes one way and then back the other. That's the real problem with like tucking your legs under like that. It's just not. So this isn't so bad. This is pretty natural because it's still even, you know. But yeah, that one side elevated thing, or like a lot of guys sit like this. Look at that. You can even see, like, look at the asymmetry there, right? And so it's just pulling on your pelvis in ways that we don't want to. So yeah, often, and here's the thing, you can sit like that. Just don't do it all day, every day, you know? Robert, it's kind of like we were talking about in last night's class, right? Thomas, I think you were around for this as well. Like we were talking about it. You know, is it likely to happen like if you do it once? Not really. You know, this is like consistency. This is also why like stretching doesn't, sometimes you'll get like relief and you're like, oh, I stretched. And then you're like, why didn't it fix all of my problems? It's like you built your problems over years of habits. Like they're not going to go away from a week of training, you know? So then we've also got hamstring, quad, and groin strains. These are common injuries. You could argue that some of these are like knee injuries as well, like part of like the femur and stuff. But a lot of times it's going to cause compensations in the entire lumbo-pelvic-hip area. So hamstring tears, quadriceps tears, groin strains right on the inside there, like all of those general aches and pains associated with the thing that is moving around the femur, you know, moving the hip joint. And the problem with that is that's going to cause compensations in those other areas. You know, like when your hamstring gets really tight, you're not going to want to extend your knee. You're not going to want to extend your, you know, or flex your hip, you know. And so then all of a sudden you're just kind of staying in one sort of shortened position all day. And then all of a sudden you're getting asymmetry between your hips again. And you guys know how much we're trying to constantly avoid asymmetry. And then we got disc herniations here at the end. This is what an actual herniated disc is. So here's the top of one of your spinal discs here, right? And so you can see like there's the spinal process that you can kind of feel if you rub your hand around like down someone's back. And then you can see these two like attachments here and here. That's where little tiny muscles are able to, you know, get an attachment and move in different directions, creating stability on both sides. And then this is your actual spinal cord. So that's your central nervous system right there, right? and it travels all the way up. And then all the branches from there, these are the little pieces of peripheral nervous system, right? So central in the middle, and then the peripheral part, right? We got to be able to connect our thoughts and our actions to, you know, away from the central system. That's where it's sort of traveling, right? So again, if we look at like CNS versus PNS, right? So like those are, oh, that's great actually. Those are kind of the bridges that we're seeing there. Right, so like it's going to travel up to here and then it'll branch out. This makes it kind of look like it's like literally ending there. That's not 100% accurate, but you can see, right, like it's going to travel, and that's what you're seeing in this picture here, right? These are the edges of the peripheral part. Now, all of your discs have this nice squishy material between them because these are hard freaking discs, you know. If we look at our spinal discs, not the numbers. If you look at your spinal discs, you know, here's sort of a different version of them, right? You can see this like, see that there's this like soft material, right? And there's the canal and there's the peripheral again, right? This soft material is keeping the discs from grinding on one another, which is good because like we really want to make sure that you know, spinal cord is very, very, very protected, right? So it kind of looks something kind of like this when it's nice and healthy. See how there's a good amount of space between all these discs. This is your S1 here, that's the bottom, that's your sacrum, right? There's your L5, L4, L3, L2, L1, right? There's your entire lumbar vertebrae right here. And so that's what they're supposed to look like. But what happens if you tear that lining, right, of that disc? Well, what you're going to experience is what's called a herniation. Herniation is actually a general medical term. It's not always related to discs. You know, like you can also get like an abdominal hernia. Quick word of advice to everybody in this call: do not Google that. It is abdominal hernias are horrifying. But it's what a hernia is it's where you tear the lining of something and something else starts leaking out.
Oh man.
Yeah. So, you know, picture.
I know somebody who has that actually.
An abdominal hernia?
Yeah, he's old too. He's an old man.
Yeah. Is it off the side or is it like literally on his belly button? Because that's like
I'm not too sure exactly, but
I can't remember the term, but
yeah.
Sometimes it'll be like it'll look like an Audi belly button and it'll stick it so far. It's really scary looking. But so a hernia is just the tearing in something with something else coming through the lining, right? In this case, it is where you tear this outer sacs edge here, and this nuclear material that we call your nuclear pupulsus starts leaking through. And when it leaks through, the nerve gets pinched between that hard tissue and that nuclear material. Okay, so you'll see bulging discs, which is basically the same thing where there's like you're losing some of it out the side, like it's kind of squeezing some of it there. And again, it's, you know, bulging that material out. That'll sometimes happen just due to like bad alignment. Actually, here we go. We can see all the sort of different versions of these injuries here. So here's like a normal healthy disc. There's a bulging one. There's an actual herniated. Okay, there's a herniated disc there where it's actually torn. You'll also see degeneration sometimes in these discs where just over time, you know, and age and stuff, you'll see like this will also just get like weird texture. And then it'll also sometimes just thin out. The space between these discs will sometimes decrease. That's another version of stenosis, by the way. That's the version of stenosis my mom was dealing with. Basically,
it
like
usually happens when you get older, right? Like,
yeah, and a lot of this is just kind of naturally going to occur, you know. And then there is also sometimes like part of that thinning. You'll see like osteocytes, where basically what an osteophyte is. Again, remember, like whenever we experience a little bit of like damage, right, our body goes, oh, and it goes to like repair by putting more bone tissue down, right? But if it creates like little, like if it does it imperfectly, it's like these little lumps, these little knobs that you'll sometimes see. And that's what we're seeing in the discs here, and again, that's because of too much impact. So what the heck? Why the heck? Why did they start slamming on one another? Well, if your if your muscles didn't support your posture the way they're supposed to, right? Like let's say I'm supposed to eccentrically decelerate just during like an elbow extension, right? But I don't do it properly, right? Let's say like the muscle just like contracts really hard instead of decelerating the way it's supposed to. Like my bicep doesn't contract at all, it doesn't decelerate the way it's supposed to, right? And what ends up happening is I just jerk my elbow. If I did this all day, every day, the bones are just being clanged into one another, and that's what's happening here because my muscles didn't support my posture in such a way that like reduced the stress on this hard tissue. And there we are. There is why we're seeing these common herniations, right? So that's what we're going to see there, and that causes irritation in the nerve because the nerve gets touched and it's really not supposed to be. And that'll cause like numbness and tingling and all kinds of problems. One of the most common that you'll hear people talk about is like sciatica. And sciatica is where like, this nerve at the very bottom of your spine, it's this bundling right here that kind of branches out and then travels down. It's in charge of controlling your legs. If you have like a herniated disc in your L4, L5, it will pinch that sciatic nerve, which will cause like a shooting leg pain sensation. But that can also happen if like there's a tight muscle in that area. That tight muscle will actually sometimes pinch it. We call that piriformis syndrome, where this muscle right here, which we're going to talk about today, actually, that is supposed to attach your sacrum to your femur, right? That nerve that's traveling down it, if that muscle gets really tight and it starts pinching that nerve, you'll get like an ache or a pain. So it's not always like your discs. Sometimes it can be, soft tissue there. Actually, that's great. You can see it's pinned between the two, right? And that causes sciatic pain or that shooting leg pain. So lots of different types of injuries there. Very common in the low back and the upper back and just the hip joint proper, So let's get a little familiar with the bones here. We have got primarily what we're going to talk about today is the lumbar spine. So like where all of your L discs are coming down, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then they're interacting with your S1, that's your sacrum. And then your two pelvic bones, the two iliums coming together, making up the actual pelvic girdle, which is, this kind of saddle looking thing that is flaring out. Like slight differences between sexes there, like women are going to have a slightly wider pelvis. Men are going to have a slightly narrower one. That's affecting the Q angle that we talked about yesterday. But like, still very much supposed to move the way it's still designed to move properly. But that's, and then we've got our femur, which is interacting with those pelvic bones, right? So lumbar spine and all the discs associated with that, we call those your intervertebral discs. And then we get your acetabulum, that's the actual pelvis, sacrum, coccyx, and then femur is the big long bone that's sort of moving around. So the big joint that we're going to spend most of our time talking about today is that acetabulofemoral joint. Which always, I have to like say it slowly. But it's like the connection with the little ligaments here, right? All that connective tissue that's sort of surrounding that ball and socket joint to create some form of stability, right? Because there's so much space here, that's great. Lots of mobility. But again, like that means it's also very likely to sort of dislocate, and we're trying to avoid that. So we're definitely seeing that connection there. And then you've got, it's the connection between the femur and the two sides there. And your femur is your longest bone in your body. Your two sacrum, your two iliums are very, very stable. Then you get your SI joint, right? Your sacroiliac joint, where this triangle shaped bone here, the sacrum, is interacting with both sides, right? And then there's this is what's called your pubic symphysis. Like I said, that's a cartilaginous joint. This area right here is really not designed to move the same way. Like look at how much range of motion a ball and socket joint has. Really every synovial joint has a lot of range of movement, you know, but we want this to be stable. This is our foundations, right? Like I don't want my house to be on wheels if it's a big house, you know, like sure, if I had like a little like trailer or something, like a little mobile home, yeah, absolutely. Like let's drive that thing around if we need to, right? It's tiny, it can handle it. Big ass house, like I don't want that to move at all. So we want it to be stable, right? That's why this is not a synovial joint. So these are some of the strongest ligaments you've got in your body that are kind of, you know, creating this webbing that kind of holds it all together. If you look at like, let's see here. If we look at this whole area, that's the bones, fascia. You'll see, yeah, see this like major webbing back here, right? Again, creating stability when maybe the bones don't necessarily have a lot of stability on their own. So it makes sense that this area can definitely tighten up if you don't move, you know? Again, the most dangerous thing that we can do is the new smoking, you know? I mean, at this point, everybody knows smoking is bad for us, you know? And then they invented vaping. Now we have to convince people that that's bad for us, which is, but like, yeah, that's also bad for us. But we know that, right? And it's like, now it's like, we're starting to really see like it's like, hey, guess what? The new smoking is sitting. Like, that's the next thing we got to teach people to like not do as often. It's like, get your butt up and just go for a 10-minute walk. That's all it takes, like 10 minutes. And then you're right back to work, you know? Go take the stairs real quick. So that is the whole lumbo-pelvic-hip area. Any questions or comments on bones or any of the joints or anything like that?
It's all good.
No questions.
Cool. All right, let's get into the muscles here. So we're going to start with the adduction movement today. So like I said earlier, the main movements that we're going to see, we've got hip flexion, we've got hip extension, we've got hip abduction, AD, we got hip adduction, that's AD, right? My legs being abducted by aliens, I'm adding it back to my body. And then we've got hip internal rotation, so I spin my femur in this way, and hip external rotation, where I spin it out that way. We'll also talk a little bit about the sacral movements, but for now, we're really just looking at the hips. Those are the big ones. So we're going to start with the hip adduction, then we'll work our way into abduction after that. So guess what? The muscles that do hip adduction, they're called your adductors. That one's pretty easy.
Makes sense.
Yep. What's that?
I'm like, makes sense.
Yeah, right. This is a pretty, there are several muscles here. This is actually kind of like a webbing. These muscles don't have a lot of natural mechanical advantage. So because of that, like there's actually a lot of them sort of working together, which is why you'll see like your adductor longus, is the long one. It's the longest, so like it's isolated function. Primarily, what does it do? It mostly does hip adduction, right? Is there an argument to be made that it does like a little bit of hip flexion as well? Sure. Yeah, it's located on the slightly front part of the thigh there. So yeah, if it pulls, it might do a little bit of hip, might kind of assist in hip flexion a little. And does it do hip internal rotation? Sure, right? Like if it's grabbing the front, whenever it pulls like this at that angle, you'll notice, yeah, it'll turn the femur, slightly inward, right? But primarily what I want what you want to be aware of is that it does hip adduction. That's its big thing. Therefore, it'll eccentrically do the exact opposite, right? It'll eccentrically lengthen during hip abduction, hip extension, and external rotation, right? And then the whole thing is there because it's attached to the pelvis. What is it going to stabilize? It's going to stabilize the lumbo-pelvic-hip complex. Oh, looking at the wrong ones, but there we go, right? So that's the adductor longus, and that's the one that you feel that one in the gracilis is the one that you feel when you do like this version, where you like really like lunge super far away and you're feeling it travel down your entire like adductor, right? You're stretching it by going into abduction, right? It's an adductor muscle. So when you abduct, it's being lengthened, it's being stretched. So that is, that's what we're seeing there, right? Like this is the one that runs all the way down. Then we've got your adductor magnus. Now this is, NASM keeps changing how they like label this out. They keep changing whether or not they want to separate them or whether they don't. But this is very similar to the biceps femoris. It's really similar. There's the adductor magnus anterior fibers and the adductor magnus posterior fibers. So you'll notice, see how like the picture here flips from like you can see the front of the knee there. And then this is like, whoops, this is showing the back of the knee, right? So it's sort of a webbing that, imagine if you had something that kind of branched out from one side and then it grabbed in the front and it grabbed in the back, right? It kind of comes from both edges there. That's how your adductor magnus is. So there's and again, this is just like the bicep. It's like, is it one muscle or is it two muscles? Well, I like to think of it as two muscles. I think that's way easier to just memorize and understand. But theoretically, it's a muscle that branches out in two different fibers. So the anterior fibers, they grab in the front, right? They're gonna go from the back of the pelvis. They're gonna wrap around. And they're gonna grab on the front there. Okay, so because it attaches to the front, when it shortens, what happens? Well, that's going to be hip flexion, right? A little bit of it. Again, what is this muscle primarily? It's literally in the name. Primarily, it's going to concentrically accelerate adduction. But because it's attached in the front, just like the longus was, it's going to do a little bit of flexion as well. And then it's going to do a little bit of internal rotation, right? So the adductor magnus's anterior fibers and the adductor longus, they're exactly the same definition there, right? Concentrically accelerates adduction, flexion, and internal rotation. Okay, but so, when you do this, and that's, by the way, why we stretch it. You guys might remember when I had you do that stretch here when we were trying to fix like the pronation distortion, right? Remember we were trying to fix the knee skate again. I had us do this stretch. You'll remember that I said, don't just go straight out and then lunge over. Line up your front heel with your back toe and then step away. So my front leg that I'm stepping away with is just a couple inches in front of my left foot. And what that does is, if you look at it, right, yes, obviously I'm abducting now, which means that my adductor is being stretched, but this leg is also slightly behind. It's slightly posterior. I am pulling it just a little into hip extension, which is the opposite of that hip flexion. Right, so that's why we do that alignment. A lot of people make that mistake of when they're doing their adductor stretches. They'll often just line both feet up perfectly, but your back leg, which is the one you're stretching, yeah, you're getting the abduction here. But like when you just pull it back an inch or two, you're also getting a little bit of hip extension. And because that muscle does a little bit of hip flexion, you get a deeper stretch, which leads me to talking about the posterior fibers. So again, the adductor magnus's posterior fibers concentrically accelerates hip adduction. There's no denying it's still an adductor muscle. Therefore, it's going to do hip adduction. But this one attaches to the back of the thigh. And because it's attached to the back of the thigh, it doesn't pull the thigh forward. It pulls it backwards, which is hip extension. So the adductor magnus's posterior fibers, and then also, instead of doing internal rotation, it does external rotation. So this actually, in some ways, the adductor magnus does a little bit of antagonistic movement, right? They both adduct, but one internally rotates and the other externally rotates. One flexes and one extends. So how do we stretch this one? Like if that, if this was, we were getting a little bit of extra stretch, is my adductor magnus posterior stretching this way? Sure, a little, because I'm still doing abduction. So yeah, but if I really want to get like a deep, thick stretch in the Magnus's posterior fibers, I need to do other parts of this. So I need to actually go into hip flexion, the opposite of extension, and I need to push my knee away like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down, abduct, but also hip flex, and that's going to feel. That's why that stretch feels really deep, like in the groin. That's your adductor magnus's posterior fibers. So there's a slight difference there. So those are our two big adductor stretches. You can do that standing version. Honestly, my favorite version. Favorite deep one is this actually. Just because it's a little bit more functional. And there's that. I can't.
Oh, yeah, I did that one, but I keep my arms out.
Oh, you do like the arm up? Yeah. Call that the world's greatest stretch. World's greatest stretch. Which is so silly because it's such a casual name, but it's like
That's fine.
Yeah, that thing is awesome. It's a two-part movement. Oh, she's adding parts to it, but yeah. It's where you go into that and then you bring the elbow down and then you bring it the opposite way. And then I guess you could do this as well.
That's crazy.
What's that?
Oh, that's crazy.
Yeah, it's a
The
good
one
one.
where her leg is out and her elbow's next to it.
Oh, I know. Yeah, that's so mobile. Yeah,
It's like
I do
a-
not have that type of groin.
Those are considered dynamic stretching, right?
Yeah, those are considered dynamic stretches. Hey, who said that? Eddie?
Me. Of
Oh
course.
man. Yeah, that's yeah, that is. We will get into dynamics at the end of the mod. Yeah, that's good.
That's technically
This
what
guy
I
already-
do wherever you
Find out. You already
work
read the whole book, didn't you?
Nah, I just been implementing those for like the past year.
Yeah,
Yeah,
dynamics are really good.
yeah. I might actually have leg day today, so that's one of the ones that I do.
Hey.
Me too. Me
Yeah.
too. Legs today.
Yeah,
No knee
fuck.
pain means legs.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I feel you.
Okay, so that's longus and then Magnus anterior and Magnus posterior. Then we've got Adductor Brevis, and this one is going to work with all those other, like the longus and the Magnus anterior. Same exact definition here. Accelerates hip adduction. It is an adductor. It does a little bit of hip flexion because it's attached in the front, and it does a little bit of hip internal rotation because it's rotated in the front and it pulls and rotates a little. But again, primarily an adductor, right? So now we got a big friggin' list, right? Longus, brevis, Magnus, and then the Magnus has the anterior and the posterior. So now we can start to see, it's not always on the list, but like, we talk about like clients who have that Instagram low back arch that we always talk about, like that anterior pelvic tilt. A lot of times it's hip flexors that are the problem. But if I'm like working on my clients' hip flexors all the time, and I'm just like, man, like what is the deal? They're just not, it's not fixing it. Like I'm stretching it, I'm strengthening the glutes, like all these things, and they're really just not getting back to that posture. I'll start to goof around with the adductors. And it's like, maybe the adductors are the thing that's causing the pelvis to get pulled down because they do hip flexion. And so I'll start working on that. And sometimes that's the answer. It's rare, that's a curveball, but it can certainly happen because they are all working together to do that. Just like a posterior pelvic tilt, oftentimes it's the hamstrings, but it can sometimes be the adductor magnus's posterior fibers. Here's the gracilis from yesterday. You'll notice I didn't put the full notes in here, but I did list the muscle. So it says like, check your notes from yesterday if you want the full definition. But again, It's attached on the inside, so it's going to accelerate hip adduction. It does slightly grab in the front, so again, a little bit of hip flexion there and a little bit of hip internal rotation. So the gracilis is doing all the same stuff that the adductor complex did, all the same stuff. But its integrative function is that it's going to do a little bit of that tibial internal rotation, which is why this is often an underactive muscle, because we know that if the feet are turning out, that's tibial external rotation. And this is where this sometimes gets a little confusing for new students. Make no mistake, I'm talking about all day today. You're going to hear me say how important it is to have external rotation. But I'm referring, I should be saying hip external rotation. That's what we want. When you're thinking about like doing a squat, drive your hips externally so that they go out this way. That's great. Tibial external rotation is where the knees are caving in and then the foot turns out in response because it comes across this way. Tibial external rotation we're trying to avoid. Hip external rotation we love. So make sure we keep, so when you're reading your test, you guys actually probably got a taste of this yesterday. If you looked at homework 3, you probably noticed how specific the language gets.
Too specific.
Right? Too specific, right? You're like, God, you really gotta always look. And that's where they get you sometimes. It's not meant to be a trick question or anything. In fact, if anything, it's an extremely clear question.
Yeah.
But when you get that many words in a row, you know, you're just like, you got to keep them all straight. It's like somebody giving you directions and saying, take a left up here, take a right over there, right, take another left, take another right. And it's like, after a while, you're like, that was 8 things, write it down. You know, that's sometimes what kines feels like. But yeah, it will feel very specific sometimes. So again, hip external rotation, big fan. Tibial external rotation, not so much. So our gracilis is often an underactive muscle. We need tibial internal rotation as much as we can. So that is that adductor, working with the adductors right there. There's also a little tiny short one called your pectineus. We don't see this show up very often, but it's working with all the other ones. It's a little tiny itty bitty adductor muscle there in the hip. This one really is like a hip flexor. The pectineus doesn't do very much adduction. I know it's in the adductor group here, but yeah, because it does. But this is one where it's like, now we're starting to be like, oh, okay, this is much more of a hip flexor, which again, if an anterior pelvic tilt problem, that's where we start to see that, right? And then it is a hip internal rotator as well. So that's the pectineus muscle. Little tiny short one that lives right up here. So that was the adduction group. That's one of our movements in the hip there. Let's take a look at the abduction group. We finally get to talk about the king of muscles, the glutes, right? Here we are, Trainer City, glute time. So your gluteus medius is the first one. This is another one that has anterior and posterior fibers. For the most part, they're going to work together though. But this is your gluteus medius here. It's going to perform hip abduction and hip internal rotation, which is always kind of surprising because you're like, I always associate the glutes with hip external rotation. Well, that's because you're thinking of the gluteus maximus's posterior fibers, which are really the ones that we spend most of our time talking about. So occasionally we'll have some overactivity in glute muscles that will sometimes cause internal rotation of the hip, but that's located near the TFL. Like, see here how this is like, you know, you can kind of see like they put like a dotted line to kind of represent that it's actually on the front there. Let's see, actually I'll pull up a picture of this. Gluteus medius anterior fibers. Your gluteus medius is running across this whole thing. And you can see this, you know, the arrows here are obviously opposite of these arrows over here, right? So like when it pulls, right, and it pulls from this angle, yeah, that's going to cause a little bit of this, right? It's going to kind of pull this down this way. It's going to rotate, you know, it's going to rotate the femur, versus this side, which will do the exact opposite. But most, like this posterior part here is much thicker. It's much, stronger than like these fibers over here. So the anterior fibers, both of them do hip abduction. Whether it's anterior or posterior, they're both abductors. And that's what your glute medius should be known for, guys. It's big job. Like when you're thinking glute medius, I want you to think of this, okay? It drives your knee out this way. But the anterior part does ever so slightly turn it, does ever so slightly turn your hip in like this, like your posterior fiber does a little bit of that. We'll talk about the hip external rotation here in just a second, but because that's going to be your gluteus maximus, and that's the main external rotator. But so again, it's like, well, what do I memorize? What of this am I going to keep in my head? Honestly, the abduction part. That's what it should be known for. So yeah. I said this. I'm just gonna say this popped into my head. This is the weirdest analogy I think I've ever used. But it's like Shaq. What's he known for? He's known as a basketball player. He's not known for his DJing. He's a great DJ. He's been doing a lot of DJing lately.
Hey, don't hate on Shaq. He's coming up.
Right. But that's your glutes, right? Like I want you to think of them as abductors. Don't think of the rotation. Now that being said, you've also got your gluteus minimus here. Now this is the one that we don't actually talk about. Sometimes people don't even know they have a glute minimus. But this is the little tiny one that lives underneath. It's hidden by those other glute muscles. It lives underneath, and it actually kind of wraps around and then shares some fascia with that TFL muscle I mentioned yesterday at the hip, your tensor fascia latae. Gluteus minimus kind of shares some fascia with that. And so this is going to do a little bit of hip abduction. It is an abductor, but it doesn't do a very good job. Your gluteus medius does a lot of the work there. But the one thing that this one does do a little bit of is that hip internal rotation, which again is what we're seeing in a client whose knees cave in. So we'll see this out of the way. This is that hip internal rotation, right? If I'm turning my knee in like this, right, I'm rotating inward. So now we've got a glute muscle that does internal rotation. We got two of them actually, right? The anterior fibers of the med and the gluteus minimus, which lives underneath it. And the reason that is the case, let's take a look here at the TFL/IT band, right? Gluteus minimus would be running from right here, and it would grab in the same spot, except it would grab a little bit more on the front, which is why it's actually rotating inward. So let's take a look here at the fascia on the outside of the thigh there. TFL. This is where it's like I have to bounce back and forth between lots of different muscles. It gets a little like, I know I'm kind of jumping the gun a little bit, but so here's your gluteus maximus. That's your main butt muscle, right? Gluteus medius would be sort of right along the edge here and running to the side, right? There you can kind of see the little dent. That's the greater trochanter. That's that big thick bone on the side of your hip. Not up top, but down below, right? On the side of the thigh almost, right? And then here's the TFL. And here's the IT band, and your gluteus minimus is going to run down and grab right there. So all this is fascia, like all this fascia is connected. It's like a webbing. So if I pulled on this, do you think it would affect these things? Yeah, of course it would. They're all like kind of webbed together, right? And that's why they all kind of get tight. This is why the gluteus minimus is the only glute muscle that sometimes is our bad guy. Oftentimes it's like, we're turning off these bad guy muscles so that we can turn on our good guy muscles, This is the only glute that's sometimes on that like tight overactive list that we sometimes need to work on. So it does do a little bit of hip abduction and it does do a little bit of internal rotation. This is the oftentimes where you'll see this on the tight muscles list is when you see somebody who has that bow-legged posture. Remember yesterday I talked about knee varus, which is definitely not as common as knee valgus, right? Knee valgus. Look at knee valgus, by the way, right? That's the one over here. The knee's caving in, gaping here. But what is that? That's hip adduction right? Actually, you know what? Copy image. What is this? This is a little bit of hip adduction. And a little bit of, now I just need to make my own, hip internal rotation. Right? So there we go. That's what knee valgus is being caused by. Knee varus is the exact opposite, right? Knee varus is hip external rotation. Wait, I just realized these are not labeled really quick. So there's a little bit of external rotation, and then it's a little bit of
Abduction.
abduction. Yep. So there we go. That's sort of what we're seeing in the difference between those two. So go back to my glute minimus. It does a little bit of abduction and it does a little bit of internal rotation. So now it's like we're getting a little bit of this with a little bit of this, which when you see people do those squats where they do this kind of thing, watch my feet here. Like I take too wide of a stance, right? And then I do like, which is abduction, but then I let my knees cave in like this, right? You'll sometimes see people who squat like that, right? They're trying to do like, you know, sumo stuff, right? But what they end up doing instead is this. It's like, ooh, glute minimus. There's our bad guy. There's our Hans Gruber. So you gotta stop that thing. You gotta turn it off. That's the only glute muscle you'll hear me say we need to turn off. Oftentimes. I mean, sometimes, you know, you'll see other ones, but that's the glute minimus. And it's because it's sharing all that fascia. It's sharing all that connective tissue with the TFL, which I'm about to talk about in a second, that is always often very, very tight. And I can't think of the last time I didn't have a client who couldn't benefit from a little bit of TFL stretching. But here we go. Let's talk about the main one. Let's talk about the butt. Gluteus maximus, king of muscles, right? Squats on squats on squats. So here we go, right? Deadlifts on deadlifts on deadlifts. So it accelerates hip extension and hip external rotation. So when we're squatting, this is why we see it all the time when we're talking about like driving your knees out during the squat, right? Great alignment here. So we're seeing like, you know, a good amount of like external rotation. Now the problem, actually his toes are, I actually don't like this. Never mind, don't use him. There we go.
He wants to be more eversion, right?
Yeah. Didn't love that. So here we see alignment, right? The kneecap is coming straight down over the second and third toe. A lot of people think they're lining up their they're lining it up with their big toe, but that's actually slightly adducted. Your kneecap really should line up with toes 2 and 3, if we're looking at it. So that's the, I mean, you can even see it if you look at me here, right? Like I'll just kind of, you know, here, let me pull it off screen share, and just that way you guys can see a little better. You know, if I keep my toe, you know, keep my toes perfectly straight forward, and then like I squat straight down, right? You can kind of see my knees are kind of coming in a little, right? Not too bad, but like obviously there could be a little. So this is why we like just a little bit of external turn. And then I'm going to drive my knees just slightly this way. And now we can see a much better sort of alignment there, right? And everybody's going to be a little bit different. Like I'm a tall guy who actually has a pretty narrow stance. Usually the taller you are, we'll often see like a wider stance. Everybody's going to be a little bit different here. That's one thing that like I've had to slowly adopt and really like learn better the longer I've become a trainer. Because I'm a very textbook person. There's a reason I became a teacher, right? I'm like, no, this is what it says in the book, you know. It's like your toes should be forward and you should push your knees out. It's like the reality is everybody's going to be a little different, you know. Some people need a really wide stance, some people need a slightly more narrow, some people need a lot of turn, some people need a little less turn.
It's weird. I see like a lot of the power lifters, like they go really wide, but I see that like their feet become supinated after time. Like it's because this is right, supinated, right?
Yep. Yeah. We don't want too much supination, but yes, sometimes you'll see a lot of it. My roommate supinates too much. We're working on his squat right now. He gets fully like, you know, fully like this when he's squatting almost.
Yeah. Is that not good?
It can be a great way to abduct. It's a great way to drive your knees out, but yeah, like the problem is then you don't have very much foot contact. So then like, you know, you're putting way too much stress on some of those abductors. That's an example where your glute minimus can tighten up.
Another question, kind of, well, I mean, I'm sure I'm going to run into it a lot. Like people that have surgery in their butt, like they have implants, like how does that work? Like, I mean, do you like build muscle on top of the implant? Like,
No, man, you've hit an area that I'm not an expert on. I've gotten this.
First of all, I don't deal with those clients. Just throw them out.
I know for sure. Like, I have a lot of my dancers, like they have like fake butts and stuff. So like,
a lot of times they'll put like saline solution in there. Like a lot. And that's the other thing is there's different types, right? There's different types of like these implants. But what they'll do is they'll put like these little fluid filled sacs between the muscle and like the fat. So the fat will be over top of it, right? And it lives under, you know, it lives on top of the muscle. The muscle's behind. The implant is superficial, the muscle's deep, but the fat is still superficial. So this is in the middle of them.
So with the client like that, would you even work out their butt? Like, is it benefit?
Oh yeah, 100%, because the muscles are still there. Yeah, I absolutely would. However, here's the thing. They're probably going to be a rare example of somebody who's actually like freaking tight in their glutes. Because like now they're going to have scar tissue. So now their glutes are going to be underactive and weaker than they're supposed to be, but they are going to be like tight and they're going to have like, you know, problems there. This is the rare, you know, usually we associate like when we simplify down, it's like tight muscles are overactive, you know. This is a tight muscle that is probably underactive. And that can still happen where it's like it's shortened, but it also just doesn't fire the way it's supposed to. So we need to break up the scar tissue and then we need to turn the muscle on, you know. It's a pain. Yeah, this is like, yeah, it's always the exceptions to the
rule. And the implant just stays in the middle as the muscle grows?
I think so, yeah. At least that's what I would assume. And I can't imagine it would have much room to really move.
Yeah.
But yeah, those things are so weird. People are like so into it too.
Like just do squats, like come on.
Right? Yeah. So let's talk about the glutes. So it does two main things. And actually what's funny is like it's the biggest muscle, it does so much. We love it so much. It really only does two things. It does hip extension and it does hip external rotation. Right? So the two jobs are this and this, you know, that external, that turn the foot away, right? So how do we work it? Well, we're going to do a lot of like, you know, anything that's hip extension, right? Think about like coming out of a lunge, right? That's hip extension, right? I'm extending this hip. Yeah, I'm doing, you know, oftentimes you feel lunges more in your quads. Sure, I'm still doing knee extension as well. It's not that I'm not doing that. But like, it just depends on like where I'm distributing the weight. There's sort of a difference between like, you know, if I had a weight on the back, on my back here, and I lunge straight down like this, you can see that's a lot of knee extension. My leg is still, the leg I'm working, which is this one, is still relatively forward. I'm extension back here, right? But that's not really where most of my weight is. But if I took weights, put them in my hands here, and then I kind of go a little bit more forward like this, and come, and then drive myself up, right? If I drive myself forward, it's a little bit more glute. But if I drive myself up, it's a little more quad. So there is a sort of slight difference in that take as well. But, you know, I'd probably do something that's a little more like hip extension specific, like an actual squat, right? So as I come out of a squat, I'm driving into extension. Or if I go into a deadlift, I'm pulling into extension, right?
I have a question. So like when you drive with your back heel, does that target obviously more of the glutes, right? As you squat down?
So yeah, generally. Obviously it can go too far if you like lose, you know, lose
Oh
your
yeah,
muscle
no,
stuff.
definitely. But mostly like, let's say in the mid to like back heel, you know what I mean? Like,
Mm-hmm.
does that also matter like how to target the glutes and or even the quads? Like I think you would have to maybe use more here.
Yeah.
Hmm.
But here's the thing about that. Like, this is like sometimes this is where like group exercise trainer and personal trainer have kind of like blurred the lines a little between each other. If you're in a group setting, you're trying to use language that's going to be the most effective for like a wide group of people. With personal training, you get to be like, you can sit there and you can really break it down. So should you tell people to drive through their heel? Yeah, that's a really great way to get a lot of people. It's gonna land for most people because most people dump all their weight in their toes. They kind of grip the floor like this. But if we're being like specific, honestly, the language, what you should be saying is like, yeah, I want you to keep some of the weight in your heel, but I also want you to spread your toes. And I want you to have an even distribution between like the outside here, like imagine this is my foot, the outside here, and the heel. We want an even distribution across the whole foot, right? I'm sure somebody's got this. Points of contact. Surely somebody has the diet. Yeah, thank God. Thank you, internet. But yeah, ideally we want, you know, an even distribution here, right? If you put all the weight on the inside, your knees are going to cave in. If you put all the weight on the outside, your knees are going to cave out. You put all the weight in your heel, you're going to lose your balance, probably going to feel like you're going to fall backwards, you know? And that's the thing. It's like, well, so then which is the best tip? Most people are putting their weight here on the front and on the inside. So if you tell them, hey, keep the weight in their heels, a lot of people, you're going to get a lot of distance, and we can be more specific maybe later down the line.
I think it's more beneficial like as explaining that to like a one-on-one client instead of a group class, right? It's a lot easier that way to explain.
Yeah, exactly. You know, and that's the thing. Like that's where, you know, they also used to say like, hey, make sure your knees aren't drifting past your toes. You hear that all the time. On a good barbell squat, your knees can totally come past your toes. Take a look here, actually. Let's see a good lateral view where I can really see that knee stuff. Actually, that's not bad. I mean, her knees are dangerously close to the edge of her. I say dangerously close. They're very close to her toes. That's not really all that. Your knee can totally do that. But the reason we tell people not to do that is because most people, they squat really far forward. Excessive lean barbell squat. A lot of people, they'll dump their chest forward, and then that causes their knees to drift forward as well. So really what we're trying to get at is like, what I want you to is keep like a nice flat neutral spine. And if I say, don't let your knees drift past your toes, it's gonna land for a lot of people. So again, this is kind of an example of like, what's the perfect coaching tip? There really isn't one, you know, it's everybody needs different stuff. You talk to somebody like me, I don't really have a problem leaning forward. I actually sometimes don't lean forward enough. And that's its own problem. That's the posterior tilt problem that sometimes people run into. Pain in the butt. So glutes, as much as I'd love to spend even more time on them, it's actually pretty simple. It's honestly an easy one. It's hip extension, which we obviously don't do enough of because we spend all day sitting, which is hip flexion, and hip external rotation, which we also don't spend enough time doing because a lot of people, you know, they keep their knees in like this. So we definitely need to strengthen that gluteus maximus. All right, let's get into the tensor fascia latae, and then Nassim is putting it together with the IT band. They're going to consider it sort of one unit here. So we've done hip adduction and we've done hip abduction. We've also started to get into a little bit of hip extension. So therefore we need to flip directions and we need to go to hip flexion. So this is your hip flexor complex. These muscles right here are all the ones that are doing hip flexion. And that's the thing about the hip flexors. They are a complex. There are lots of muscles do hip flexion, and we haven't seen that many muscles do hip extension, right? We got the poor glute all by itself working in the realm of hip extension. You know, maybe there's a little bit of that posterior adductor magnus. The hamstring muscles from yesterday, they do a little bit of hip extension, but look at all these muscles that have to work against, you know, the gluteus maximus. There's a reason, you know, that and the fact that we sit all day, there's a reason these muscles get tight. So tensor fascia latae is the first one on our hip flexor list. It's going to concentrically accelerate hip flexion. So your TFL, little muscle right here, it does a little bit of this, right? But it is also, because it is sort of off to the side, it is also going to do rotational movements. It's going to concentrically accelerate hip flexion. Whoops. It's going to concentrically accelerate hip flexion and hip external rotation. You can even feel it. Place your hand below the knob on the front here, but above here, just place it basically on your pocket and squeeze like this. You'll feel it pull inward.
I don't feel it myself too.
What's that? You feel it?
Yeah.
And then it does do a little bit of hip abduction because it is off to the side, but very weakly. The TFL is doing a little bit of that. Like, you can also feel it a little bit when you go like this. But this is where the trap is, right? This is where it gets so complicated and so many people make this mistake. So what they'll do is they'll like feel it in their TFL and they'll tighten up that TFL muscle, which is a bad muscle we do not want to tighten up. Like, this is tight on nearly every client we've got, but they'll feel it when they're doing abduction more in their TFL than they will feel it in like the gluteus medius, which is why we often need to make sure we turn this off before we do our leg raises. We got to get in there with a foam roller, mash this thing up and inhibit it, and then do like a stretch to really get it just shut down. Then I can do some activation techniques for my side butt muscles, my gluteus medius, and actually get them to do their job. But this muscle just loves to get overactive. It's tight on everybody. It's tight on me. And I don't even have like that bad of a knee caving in problem. I'm more of a extensor. I have like extensor problems, not flexor problems. And this is still a muscle that's tight on me. So like, it's just everybody. Actually, you know what? This is a good example for me. Yeah, this is a good example of a muscle that is tight and weak, which is the sort of like exception, you know? Freaking thing, hate it. By the way, and then the IT band portion is down here. So I will say this, when I was in school, it was really popular to foam roll the IT band. It's really popular to kind of work on this and roll this. But you're seeing nowadays, you're seeing like what people do. You know, you get this. Oh, that's not what I wanted. You see the guy's face. Anyway, it is very painful. It freaking hurts because it's mostly fascia, and fascia is just really tender. So this is kind of fallen out of popularity nowadays in terms of the foam rolling. And nowadays they're saying just foam roll the TFL. Instead, we're getting into sort of this version. If you can just stay above that trochanter on the hip and just stay in the little pocket there, you know, there's the knob. So we stay above it right here. That's going to be much more effective. And then slightly lean forward a little bit too, so that you get into the hip flexion portion right in here. So This guy's actually pretty far. His chest is kind of upright, actually. I would say you'd get a little bit more out of it, slightly leaning forward like this. And that would keep you on that anterior portion. But here's the thing. If you can roll it and not make a face and just relax and like actually not tighten up, I don't know. Maybe it's just the fact that God, this is weird. I'm only in my 30s, but it's starting to feel like I'm old school. Maybe I'm like, maybe I'm a little old fashioned, but like, I think if you can still maintain a relax, like if you can not tighten up and like consciously like relax that all, I think that there's still room for, working on this fascia down here sometimes, because there is some scar tissue, if you've ever had runner's knee or runner's hip, where that TFL and the IT band are rubbing on the greater trochanter, that's runner's hip, or if they're rubbing on the knee down here, that's runner's knee. We talked about that yesterday. I think there's still room to sort of loosen that up through foam rolling and stretching.
What kind of stretching would you do to loosen that up?
Yeah, so what's it do? It does abduction, right? So what do we need to do? We need to do adduction, and then it does, so how do you stretch your IT band? Looks like this. It's kind of weird looking. There's two versions that are going to be really popular. There's the standing version, which looks like this. You do this kind of weird motion here. So what you do is you take your leg behind. So now I'm in hip extension, which is the opposite of flexion. So that's stretching it a little, right? And then it does abduction. So I'm going to do adduction. I'm going to bring it behind me like that. And then I'm just going to kind of lean away. And you'll feel that right in here. And then sometimes like you'll even like take yourself this way, like against like a wall. That can help. But my favorite version is just laying down like this with like a band across. You'll feel that right along the outside of the knee. But that's a pretty deep stretch. That's why you're not seeing too many pictures of it, honestly. You're not seeing too many people do this, just because this one, it kind of hurts a little. It's like this is a tight stretch. But I'll use you use a strap and you come across the body that way. But I will say, this is like hip flexion, the thighs in front instead of behind. So is this the best stretch? I don't know. I like it. But those are the two. So that's the IT band and TFL. Next one we've got is the psoas muscle, which if you ever get really tight in your hip flexors will be so as hell. So this is a big hip flexor here. We talk about that anterior pelvic tilt problem, right? We talk about this problem here with that excessive scooping. This is a big one for that. Now, this is actually attached to your spine, right about here, just right around the belly button, and down, and then grabbing the femur here. So now we're starting to see our first connection directly to our spine. We're starting to see our first connection directly to our discs and like a really big, mover muscle. This is not an abdominal muscle, but it is in your abdomen. So it's grabbing our spine, it's grabbing the discs right there. And then also you can see, by the way, bottom rib. It's not actually attached to the ribs. It's just below it. And runs all the way down and grabs the femur there. So again, hip flexion, right? And this is tightened up whenever we are sitting, right? My psoas muscle is contracted right now. So then if I go to stand, and it just wants to stay in that position, there we go. There's my excessive low back arch, right? So accelerates hip flexion. It does do a little bit of external rotation, but don't give it any credit for that. But the other things that it does is it does spinal extension. It grabs my spine and it pulls it forward, right? And gives me that excessive arch. So spinal extension, and then because there are two sides of it and they are pulling off to the side, it also does a little bit of spinal rotation. But again, that's not what I want you to think of. What I want you to think of when you think of psoas, hip flexion and spinal extension, which leads us to one of those postural distortions that I mentioned, lower crossed syndrome, right? Remember, that is an anterior pelvic tilt, which is caused by tight hip flexor muscles, okay? And tight, it's too much spinal extension and it's too much hip flexion, and not enough hip extension and not enough spinal flexion, right? So there it is. Like, this muscle is doing both of those things. Therefore, it's one of our big bads. So that's your psoas. And then there's another muscle called your iliacus just below it. So this is the front. This looks really similar to the glutes, by the way. Don't make a mistake though. This is the front. See how the sacrum kind of comes behind here? It looks so similar to this. And I've had people like fall for that before. But this is on the front inside portion of the acetabulum. So this is the front of my pelvis. You can actually kind of feel this. It's really hard. And do not go digging around too much, guys. But if you find that knob right here, you kind of dig just on the inside of it. Make sure you're not doing this up here. Your appendix is there, and I don't want anybody to rupture their appendix. But if you just go barely on the inside of that ridge, you'll sometimes feel this muscle. That's your iliacus, okay? And it runs in the same place. So it's doing a little bit of hip flexion as well. And it does do a little bit of hip external rotation, just like the psoas did. But again, I don't want you to give that any credit. It is a hip flexor. So Nassim's going to put these two muscles together because these two guys are going to work directly together. You can see this. The combined effort of the psoas with the iliacus is generally referred to as the iliopsoas. So is the iliopsoas one muscle? Some people say yes. I consider them two separate muscles, but that's the psoas, that's the iliacus. And as you can actually see in the picture here, there's the iliacus behind it.
Oh yeah,
right there. And there's all your adductor muscles right there. Right? Pectineus and Magnus and longus. But yeah, so there's those muscles right there, and they both insert onto the same spot, but one grabs the pelvis here and one runs up and starts grabbing the spine. So when I say tight hip flexors, we're starting to get a pretty good working list here, right? TFL, which would run right here, IT band and run down, and then psoas and iliacus, or we would simplify that to say TFL and iliopsoas. Those are the big bads.
And all those are primarily for hip motion, correct?
Hip flexion. Yep. Primarily this thing here. Again, Instagram booty, right? Until today, we've been talking a lot about pronation distortion syndrome. We are going to start for the next couple days moving into talking about lower crossed syndrome, which is this, right? A glute that's doing nothing and a low back and hip that's doing too much. So it's a cross, by the way, because this is what's weak, right? And this is what's tight. The hips and the low back are tight. The glutes and the abs are weak. X. Cross. Hey, you know what would have helped kinesiology students? I just made this connection. If they called it lower cruciate syndrome, because then that would help us all remember our cruciate ligaments as well. So anyway, that's not what it's called. So there's our next hip flexor. We have our sartorius. You guys will remember that one from yesterday. Remember I said it's a knee stabilizer, and that's primarily what we think of when we're thinking of it, but it is also a hip flexor here. It's grabbing the front knob. It's starting on the same place as the TFL did, but instead of running over here, it runs down on the inside of the thigh and grabs here. So it's doing a little bit of that tibial internal rotation that we need more of, right? Again, we don't need any more hip internal rotation, but we do need that tibial internal rotation. So the sartorius is there to kind of help with that and stabilize the knee. So that's actually one of our hip flexor muscles that, you know, it's like, uh-oh, should we strengthen this or should we stretch it? And it's like, well, let's stretch it when it's a hip flexor. Let's strengthen it when it's a knee stabilizer. So do some stable exercises standing on one leg, and still do your kneeling, your kneeling hip flexor stretch. So now you can see our sort of one of our favorite stretches here. I'm just going to do this because my knees are a little sore today. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to take myself into hip extension. And then I'm going to lean back slightly, right? So that leaning back action is going to stretch out my psoas and my iliacus and my rectus femoris, which is that knee muscle from yesterday. And if I take my arm up, there's more psoas. And then if I lean away, now I'm also getting my TFL roll. So that's why this is sort of our favorite. Now, one thing I need to do on this, I need to make sure I'm not arching my low back, because that's allowing my psoas to relax now because it arches my back. So what I need to do is I need to squeeze my glutes and posteriorly tilt my pelvis and then come forward. And if I do that, I'm really going to be getting a good stretch there. A lot of people make that mistake. They'll do a kneeling hip flexor stretch. In fact, I'm sure I'll find a picture. See too many people doing this. And that's not too bad, but you'll see way too many people doing this. There we go. Look at that. She's trying to fix an anterior pelvic tilt by anteriorly tilting her pelvis. That's like, yeah, it's not how that works, right? She needs to squeeze her glute. Like, I love this part, but she needs to squeeze her glute more and get her pelvis back to neutral and then lean back. Like you can see in some other versions, if I found a good one. Yeah, there we go. That's much more neutral, right? So we're starting to see some double ups, right? We saw the sartorius again. We saw the gracilis again. We're starting to see our hamstring muscles show up again. Our rectus femoris is going to show up again. And then we're going to get into the actual ab stuff here in just a second. One last muscle, though, that's very new in the hip is that piriformis muscle I mentioned earlier today. The piriformis is grabbing your sacrum, that little triangle bone, and it runs out. So it does do a little bit of hip external rotation. That's its main job, is to externally rotate. So it's working with the glute. Remember earlier I said the glute has no helpers, right? Like the poor gluteus maximus doesn't get any help when it comes to that external rotation that we need more of, right? This muscle does. This muscle's there to help it, but it's attached to the sacrum here, which isn't quite as stable as being attached to the pelvis. So little tiny muscle. Again, it's working against all those muscles that are internally rotating. So again, this kind of makes sense that this one sometimes isn't getting as much contraction as it needs to. But that's going to accelerate the external rotation. It's going to do a little bit of abduction. It is theoretically attached to the back. It does do a little bit of hip extension, but again, like I don't really think of the piriformis when I think of hip extension. Now, here's the thing. Unfortunately, this is often one of our bad guy muscles. I know we need more external rotation. I know we need more abduction, but this is one of the muscles that kind of takes that to the extremes. And when it tightens up, it starts to pinch that piriformis, or it starts to pinch that sciatic nerve we talked about. So when you see a bow-legged posture, you see that knee varus, this is the muscle that's often responsible for it. Because remember, knee varus, actually, wait, do I still have this up? Yeah. Never mind, I got my chart still. So knee varus, that bow-legged posture that's also not so great. John Wayne walking into a saloon, honestly, and that's actually, that's a joke that I'm making, but honestly, like people who ride horses, because they're going like this and then they're squeezing with their heels. Because that's the best way to stay on a freaking horse. But it's the piriformis, this short little butt muscle back here. And then they're doing that like pairing that up with some inversion, right? Often, I shouldn't say often, but sometimes tight. So that's one. This is the only muscle in the body, by the way. When I talk about foam rolling and stuff, we really only foam roll superficial muscles because like it's really difficult to, you know, we were talking about the superficial stuff, right? Like foam rolling, if you had those butt implants earlier, it's going to make foam rolling kind of necessary because there's scar tissue, but at the same time, we don't want to pop those. I don't know, man, like makes me nervous. But this is one of the only muscles that we actually, what's that?
I gotta show you this Brazilian bodybuilder. She has implants, but she's like a bodybuilder. She literally has the biggest butt like in the world. Like it's and like I see her do like these crazy ass like deadlifts and stuff. I'm like, how does that not just like pop in your butt? It's crazy.
I don't know, man. I have no idea. I wish I need to do more learning about that implant stuff.
Yeah, like if you get an implant, it's not your muscle.
Yeah.
Do they connect it to your muscle so that you could use it like it's your muscle?
No, because it wouldn't have contractile proteins and it wouldn't
So
be able to
then-
control your nervous system.
So then how is this lady doing those well, I guess deadlifts are
Well, it's all underneath. She still has the stuff.
Yeah.
It's still around. You know, it still
Yeah.
exists. It's
okay,
just
what if she does like the hip thrust? That's your glutes,
He does it
right?
all.
I'm
She does
sure
it
she
all,
still
huh?
can. It's
Well,
just
yeah,
there's
so-
imagine if Arnold Schwarzenegger with his big honking biceps
Yeah.
opened up the skin and then shoved
Ugh.
something between the muscle and the skin. He'd still be able to do this.
Yeah, so then if they do that, they don't take out all your muscles, right? They don't cut
No.
your muscle.
No, not at all.
They just put more in there.
Yeah, basically.
Oh my god.
It's
Okay.
crazy.
Look at this girl.
Easy, dog.
She is not happy right now.
Right.
But you can see this is a piriformis foam rolling, by the way.
Yeah.
This is the only time we foam roll or SMR. This is the only time we SMR deep muscles. Normally, it's only the superficial stuff. What's this girl's name?
Swelling. So watch, I'll show you. She's a bodybuilder from Brazil. She won the Arnold a couple times. Isn't that crazy?
Ay.
So like she was already like really like big, but like
Yeah.
she wanted like a bigger butt. It's so crazy. She danced for me at one of my events. She's awesome.
No way.
Crazy, right?
That's great.
And they don't work out. Like I guess she doesn't really do a lot of stretching, but like it's crazy to watch her work out. Like you really feel like she's gonna explode.
That's so freaky.
Isn't that crazy?
Ouch.
How did she do it?
I don't like it. Oh. This stuff makes me so nervous. I can't handle it.
Yeah, no, I know what you're saying. Yeah.
That's like, you know, like I know sometimes people like watching like gym fails. I can't watch.
Oh,
I've
yeah.
seen too many
I can't
actual
either.
gym, like actual injuries that like, you know, some people can separate themselves because they're fine. You know, nobody actually gets hurt. But it's
Yeah.
like in my brain, I'm like, they could have gotten hurt and I just can't. Ugh,
Yeah.
freaks me out. Okay. So talking about hip extension, we got to mention the hamstrings again. We're going to move through these relatively quick because we already kind of talked about them yesterday, but you know, those hamstrings, right? You'll notice we got 3 of them. We did, and there's my pictures. Oh, I remember this. I took the photo out because it was the wrong picture on the PowerPoint. It was just the semi-membranosus again. That's funny. So notice how, I remember yesterday I said there's 4 hamstring muscles you have to memorize, right? Long head, short head, membranosus, tendinosus, right? But here's the thing. The long head's the only one that's attached at the hip, along with the membranosus and picture missing, but the tendinosus. Those are the 3 that are attached to it. The short head started on the femur. That's why it's not relevant to today's lesson. So then that'll kind of help you remember that when you're remembering like the one that does the tibial external rotation. That's always the short head. The long head does it as well, but the long head is often not our bad guy. The real big bad is the short head that's starting here. That does that tibial external. But that means that the hamstrings are there to help. This is why the deadlift is so good for us. It is primarily like a glute exercise, but it definitely works your hamstrings. And then there's all of our deadlift variations, right? So what's the difference between like deadlift versus a Romanian deadlift, like an RDL,
Yeah.
you know, both of them are good. But it's like, it just depends on like what you're working on, right? If I'm doing a conventional deadlift, that's going to be more glutes. But if I'm doing an RDL, that's going to be more hamstrings. Both are good. I really do like them both. You know, I've got nothing against people who do, or sumo deadlifts. I think sumo deadlifts are great. They're just different. They're just used for different things. I actually also don't have anything against kipping pull-ups.
Against who?
The swinging pull-ups.
Oh, like
Okay.
the CrossFit guys do?
Like the CrossFit stuff. I actually don't hate that exercise. I don't call it a pull-up. Right?
Like, I'm
wouldn't-
into calisthenics. I'm like, in my head, I'm like, are they even working something when they do that? Like, are they
it's a
doing
rowing
something?
action. They're working
Okay.
like the rower muscles. It's closer to like a Australia or calisthenics.
Oh.
It's closer to an Australian pull-up
Yeah, I see
than
what
it
you
is to a
mean.
pull-up.
Gotcha.
But it's still a legitimate exercise. That's the same thing with the Romanian deadlift and the deadlift. I think they're both for your glutes, but they just put the shift in one spot or another.
Mhm.
That's being, you know, that's lunges versus squats.
Right.
Both great. And then of the quadriceps muscles from yesterday, we got the rectus femoris, right? God, that looks like it almost looks like the vastus intermedius. But that's, let's pull up a better picture in case they goofed that one up as well. Rectus femoris, you know, it is that quadricep that is also a hip flexor, right? It's the one that lives on top of everything. So it is running from that ASIS on the pelvis all the way down onto the tibia there. Okay, well, we can't talk about the lumbo-pelvic-hip complex without talking about the lumbo part. So we're going to get into our abdominals here. Now, before we do, I want to teach you a term that you're going to see in later classes much more often. You've got 3 systems in your abs. You have got your local stabilization system, your global stabilization system, and your global movement system. So these are the 3 sort of ab systems here, right? So local stabilization system, it's there, it's very local, it's closer to your center. What's the most center thing you've got? Your spine. Therefore, these are the muscles that are directly attached to the spine, and they're there to stabilize it. So when you think about creating stability, you would want to create stability in the front. You'd want to create stability in the back. So it's like the front of a box, the back of a box. You'd want to create the stability on the sides. So the sides of the box, down below and up above. So it's 6 sides to a box, right? Stability in the front, stability in the back, stability on both sides, top and bottom. So that is going to be the transverse abdominis in the front, the multifidus in the back, the internal obliques on both sides, your pelvic floor muscles, and then your diaphragm, which is actually a breathing muscle, but it does create stability inward. That's why you get the wind knocked out of you when you get hit in the gut and you feel like you can't breathe, because it's there. Not only now it can't create stability, and it can't open your lungs up. That's the local, closest to the middle, stabilization system. These are all the muscles that stabilize. Remember I mentioned there's going to be only one muscle on our list for the most part that won't say concentrically accelerate so-and-so. These are those muscles. They're going to stabilize everything. They're not really moving anything around. They're just there to create stability. Then you got the global stabilization system. These are the muscles that actually move the spine. So the outer 6-pack muscle, right? The abs on the outside that grab your sternum and pull you down like this, flexing the spine. Yeah, that's movement. That's the muscles you see. So planks stabilize the spine. They don't really make your abs any bigger. Crunches move your spine. They make, you know, that's the 6-pack definition we're all going for. Does that mean you don't need to do planks? No. So many of our problems are people who move their spine too much, excessive spinal movement. So that's the global stabilization system. It's around the globe, right? It's around the outside. and it's moving things around. That's going to be your rectus abdominis, your erector spinae, your QL muscles that go side to side, your external obliques, right? And then you get your global movement system that attaches your pelvis to your spine. That's where we're starting to get into the glutes, the rectus femoris, the hip flexors, right? All the stuff we've been talking about. So those are some systems that we're going to see in later classes when we're talking about core training. And it's how we are sort of separating these things out. So your rectus abdominis is part of that global stabilization system. It does create some spinal stability, but it's mostly there to move the spine around. It attaches from the bottom of the sternum here down to the pelvis. Therefore, when it pulls, it flexes your spine. So it concentrically accelerates spinal flexion. It does do a little bit of side-to-side movement, although really not much. And it does do a little bit of rotational movement, although really not much. And it is there to create some stability in the spine. Although, again, like I said, the transverse abdominis is the king of the show when it comes to creating stability. What I want you to know, what I want you to think of when you think of the rectus abdominis is think of that spinal flexion. Then we got the external obliques. Those are those oblique muscles we see on the side, right? Doesn't look very interesting under, like, you know, the anatomy picture makes it look like webbing. But this is sort of what they look like. That's the anatomy of it. But, you know, on a person, it practically looks like this when there's all the like skin stuff, right? So it's those oblique muscles off to the side, right? So your external obliques accelerate. Oh, they do also kind of similar to how the rectus does a little bit of rotation, but it should be known as flexion. The external obliques do a little bit of flexion, but what I want you to think of is I want you to think of spinal rotation. And then a little bit of lateral flexion as well. However, never do this, guys. This exercise sucks. It's literally my least favorite exercise in the gym. Because all it does is strengthen up this muscle that we're going to talk about in a minute. And makes that, screws up your pelvic alignment. So that's the external obliques, spinal flexion a little bit, lateral flexion. And it does do a little bit of, like, when it does rotation, by the way, it does contralateral rotation. So the right rotates me to the left rotates me to the right. That's the contralateral. Okay. Internal obliques, totally the opposite of the external obliques. So a little bit of spinal flexion there, a little bit of lateral flexion there, but that does ipsilateral rotation. So my internal obliques, my right side rotates me to the right, my left rotates me to the left. Then you got the transverse abdominis, that's the stabilizer. There it is. Concentrically, nope, not this time. Transverse, it just increases intra-abdominal pressure. So we don't have concentric stuff here. It does shorten, for the record, but like we just don't say it that way. So it's there to create pressure. Same thing with your diaphragm, except your diaphragm does do a little bit of concentric. It grabs the tendon here and pulls your lungs open. But now we're starting to see the inner ab stuff, right? So this layers underneath, and then this layers over top. And that's the transverse abdominis versus the rectus abdominis. And then your diaphragm is right here. It also creates a little bit of stability there. Moving to the back side, we've got the erector spinae. This is the opposite of the rectus abdominis. This is a spinal mover, not a spinal stabilizer. So when you think about like somebody who's like, oh, I have low back pain, they're like, oh, you need to strengthen your erector spinae. I don't like that. I disagree. I think that like strengthening your erector spinae, if you have back pain, all that does is teach you further how to move your spine. I think back pain doesn't come from a lack of movement. I think from back pain comes from excessive movement. What you need to do is you need to learn how to hold your spine in place, which is all the muscles that live underneath your erector spinae. What the heck is that? So Your erector spinae is very superficial. It accelerates spinal extension, and it does do spinal rotation, and it does do a little bit of this. But again, when you think of the erector spinae, think of the spinal extension. So again, we go back to that lower cross syndrome. We're starting to see our overactive muscles, right? We saw earlier, it was the iliopsoas, and now it's also the erector spinae. So people will do like, they'll have low back pain, and they'll have an anterior pelvic tilt, and they'll go to the gym and they'll do like Superman exercises because they're like, oh, I have back pain, I need to strengthen my back. And it's like, that is literally making it worse. You need to do planks. And you need to squeeze your butt, planks and squats. So then underneath it, oh, the notes in the, whoops, I got my notes in the wrong order. Next, you've got your quadratus lumborum. This is the lateral movement. This is why I hate that dumbbell side bend. I hate that exercise because it strengthens this muscle right here. This is called your QL, your quadratus lumborum. It does the lateral flexion stuff. See how it's attached to the spine, grabs the pelvis, it grabs it and it pulls it up. So it does this movement here, right? And when you do this, it just rips your freaking pelvis out of alignment. That is not a synovial joint where they connect, right? Remember, it's a cartilaginous. This is not supposed to move a lot. So like when you're training it to shorten up, it's the equivalent of, like we talked about earlier, sitting on your wallet all day. Hate side bends. I just hate them. If you really want to strengthen that, you really want to like get that. If that's something that's like a goal of yours, you're like, I want to be able to do like lateral movement like that, then do single-sided farmer's carries. Go do a farmer's carry with a dumbbell in one hand instead of the other. And then like, you'll grab it and then, this side's doing nothing and just walk with a really heavy dumbbell, or even do like the barbell version where then you have to like balance a little bit as you're walking because it'll tip forward or tip backwards. Do that instead, because then you'll create stability. You will learn how to hold your spine instead of how to excessively move your spine. We are already good at this. We do this all day. We don't need to train for it. I'm sure there's an exception to the rule out there. There's some athlete or something that I'm not thinking of that could use something like that. But like, honestly, guys, that is my least favorite. That's my soapbox for the day. That's my like, burn it. Burn all records of it, get it rid of it. Nobody does it. I hate that. And I hate traps too. Those are my two least favorite exercises.
It's funny, I never implemented those ever.
Why is the traps not good?
Because look at what I'm doing literally right now with my hands on my keyboard and my mouse.
You know what's weird? I never work out my traps ever. And then like everybody's like, oh, your traps are huge. What do you do? I'm like,
deadlifts.
Maybe you do a lot of shoulder press and like military press. That helps too. Right.
That's the thing. You'll get it from the, functional movements. Yeah. So this is just not very functional.
No.
So I don't know. I don't hate that one as much, but
I hurt my shoulder a lot too when I do that.
Yeah. So many people have tight trap muscles. I know they look good. Like I'm not against doing them, but I have not done like a trap raise probably since college. And like, I'm not the biggest, most muscular guy in the world, but like, they're not that bad already, and I have never trained them. So it's
yeah. When I flex my back, I can see my traps too. And I don't even do those either.
Yeah. Well, you'll get a deep explanation of why I hate them when we get to the shoulder stuff tomorrow, or by tomorrow, I of course mean Monday.
I can't wait. I need to learn so much about my shoulder stuff too. Yeah.
Last one we've got is your multifidus. Now this is where, how many muscles are in the body? Is it 500? Is it 400? This is where that argument goes to hell, because technically each of these is an individual muscle. They're all the little tiny muscles between all of your spinal discs that are stabilizing the spine. Remember, this is if your rectus abdominis is sort of the opposite of your erector spinae, your transverse abdominis is sort of the opposite of your multifidus, at least in terms of their location. But what it does is it does a little bit of spinal extension, just like the erector spinae does. It's living underneath it. And it does do the rotational movements. But really, honestly, this is where the integrative function, in my opinion, is more important. What it does is it stabilizes the spine. It stabilizes every one of your discs and holds them in place. So do I like the Superman? Not really. But if you want to do like a prone cobra and then isometrically hold, love that. Or if you want to do a bird dog, love that. Both of those are great for stabilizing the spine. Again, I think a lot of our spinal problems, guys, they don't come from lack of movement. They come from excessive movement. You get your discs that are being ripped around, moved way too much.
So you would say I do this exercise where like I hold a weight and then I come up. Is that good? Is that not good for your back?
It's good for your erector spinae.
Okay.
And I do like it. It's also a little bit of hip extension. So you get a little bit of glute work in there too. I love, we call those hyperextensions. I love that exercise. A little bit of hamstring work too, you know, not bad. I like all that posterior strengthening, but if you are using it to fix back pain, it's not going to get you very far because it's a lot of movement instead of stability.
What I want is like the frame, like back frame.
The V?
Yeah.
If that's what you want, you should do some wide grip pull-ups.
Really?
Yeah. That'll give you this muscle actually that we're seeing here. I put this on the, I actually added this one to the PowerPoint. This is not officially, I want to leave this for shoulder day. But just so you guys know, it does have some fascia that's attached to your pelvis down here. Your lats also do a little bit of spinal extension. Not a lot, but some. It just grabs the top of your pelvis and it pulls it like that. But yeah, you want that V. Those are really good, by the way. Like you should keep doing that back extension. I love that exercise. But throw in some wide grip pull-ups. That's the best way to kind of build this under here. And then also build out your delts. Like, don't forget about that. Like that creates the visual idea of the V. All right, so let's retool it. We've got our movements. We got hip flexion and we got hip extension. So big hip flexor, that's going to be, go through all the movements. Then we got hip abduction versus hip adduction. We got hip, hip internal rotation. That's turning the foot inward. And we got hip external rotation. Then if we're talking about the spine, we've got anterior pelvic tilting, which is sort of hip flexion combined with spinal extension. And then we got posterior pelvic tilting, which is hip extension paired with spinal flexion. So that's the lower cross syndrome here. And then this is the butt winking over here. Then we got the lateral movement. I remember this. Do you guys remember old school Conan O'Brien? He would always do the like the pelvic strings thing that he would do. Do you remember this? He would do the jump, and then he would turn off the band, and then he would do the shoulder, the hip strings, and he would cut them.
That's so crazy, dude.
It was so weird. I don't know why he did this. That's the lateral flexion. So the side to side movement.
I don't know. I feel like Shakira does it better.
What's that?
I feel like Shakira does it better.
Yeah, right. There we go. Yeah, maybe a little. There is also pelvic rotation here as well. We've got like, if we go like left to right or right to left, you know, the little twisting. That's the transverse stuff. And that is where like it gets a little complicated, but it's like tighten the front and up high. And then we have to go to the other side of the body and down. We have to go in like the cross this way. And that's where it's a real pain in the butt. That's why they don't even address it in your regular textbook. It shows up in corrective. Spinal flexion versus, and then cervical flexion as well. We'll see that on the neck day. And then spinal extension plus cervical extension while we're at it. And then rotation. So our agonists for the abduction, or I'm sorry, for hip flexion. This is your hip flexor complex. It's going to be your rectus femoris, the big one that was also a quad muscle. The iliopsoas, that's your iliacus plus your psoas. The tensor fasciae latae, and then that sartorius muscle that does knee stabilize as well. All of those are the hip flexors. Then you get your hip extensors, mostly your gluteus maximus. And then a little bit of those hamstring muscles, biceps femoris, but not short head. And then medial hamstring. So lateral hamstring plus medial hamstring. Then we've got your abductors, the gluteus medius. So off to the side there. A little bit of the gluteus minimus. A little bit of TFL. It gets credit for this, but it really shouldn't. And then that's sartorius and piriformis muscles, those little tiny short ones, right? Sartorius is that stabilizer that, like I said, really should be known as like a knee stabilizer or hip flexor. And then the piriformis back there does do a little bit of abduction, but again, it's just living underneath all this stuff. That's often tightens up. Then we got the hip adductors. It's your entire adductor complex. The adductor magnus, posterior plus anterior, your adductor longus, and your adductor brevis, and then the gracilis, that really thin, really long muscle running the whole length. And then there's that little tiny short one that's your pectineus, which actually should have been on my hip flexor list as well. Just while I'm at it. Hip internal rotators. Those are some of the adductors, right? Longus, magnus, brevis. Although when it comes to the magnus, remember, when it comes to internal rotation, that's only the anterior part because it's attached in the front. That's why it pulls in. The posterior fibers actually do the external rotation. And then we see a lot of hip. Look at how many hip internal rotators there are. And then look at these little tiny external rotators that are just trying to keep up. Not doing a good job, not able to do it. We see so many people whose knees cave in. External rotators, right? We do see the piriformis there, right? We see the sartorius a little. Somewhat of your iliopsoas muscles, but like, again, not getting credit for that really. But the posterior fibers, and then the big one, the big external rotator that I want you to obviously think of is your glutes, your poor gluteus maximus here leading the show against this giant list of muscles over here. And then when it comes to the spine, right, we got the anterior pelvic rotation. That's the rectus femoris plus the iliacus plus the psoas. So the iliopsoas plus rectus femoris plus that's pulling down the front, but then we get the erector spinae pulling up in the back. Whole thing. That also gets to work together with your TFL. Then we got the posterior pelvic tilt, the flat spine, not so good either. That's the erectus abdominis. That's actually the abdominal muscles pulling up in the front. Again, remember the abdominals are sort of the opposite of the erector spinae. So one's pulling one way, this one pulls the other way. So there's the rectus abdominis, and then the glutes and hamstrings are pulling down the back. Make no mistake though, the glutes are not overactive. Nobody out there has too much glute work. And then those hamstring muscles, those are the big bads, really pulling down the back. So lumbar flexion, that's the rectus abdominis is the big one, but then also those oblique muscles are kind of helping a little. Remember, I did say the obliques do help with crunches. Even if you were to only do crunches and you never did any rotational movement, you'd still have decent obliques. They do help.
Especially when you do like the decline ones, huh? You could definitely target like the whole like
yeah
ab area, yeah.
Yeah, I do like making sure that I address both of the shelves. I mean, your whole abs are going to contract no matter what type you're doing, whether it's leg raises or crunches, but yeah. And then on the back side, we got the lumbar extensors. That's the erector spinae and multifidus. And then your rotational movements. Like I said, the rectus abdominis will also do a little bit of rotation, but it's the oblique muscles, they're the big lifters there. And that's it, guys. You survived a ton of slides today. A lot of muscles.
A lot of information today.
I know. It was a big one. We're a little, yeah.
Thank God it's Friday.
Yeah, I know, right?
Doing my Friday, Brad.
I know. But it's all recorded.
Friday great. Makes your Friday great. You talked a lot.
Hey, Brad. I think I did the wrong homework. Like I was a little confused.
Happens all the time.
Which one?
Yeah, happens all the time. I'll take a look at it. I think I can reset it for you.
Okay, cool. How do you go to the one that you're supposed to go to? Because I kind of I tried assignments and then I tried quizzes and
So my advice, stay away from those buttons.
Okay.
My advice is to never go there. If you're going to go to your homework, go to day 2, 4, 6.
Yeah.
That's
what I started doing is I started writing down because he always tells us day 1, day 2, day 3.
Yeah.
So I just look for that day instead of looking up let's say yesterday hamstrings and ankle this and that. I just look up what day it is, on my notes, right? All right, today was what? Day 9.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So today, day 9. If we had homework, you find day 9.
Yeah.
And it should be there.
It's that happens, Hector. You're not the first. You won't be the last. Everybody does that all the time. But yeah, the assignments page, it puts it in alphabetical order instead.
Okay.
And I can't get it to reorganize.
So it'll be, I'll go to the module that says day 8, and then the homework is right there.
Yep.
Should be.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
So today's day 9, no homework today, but on Monday it'll be day 10. So that'll be homework 4.
Okay, cool.
Every other day.
Homework on Monday.
Yep. Even numbered days. That's the easiest way to remember it.
Okay, cool. And then just go to the module and then I'll say homework.
Yep.
Okay. Cool.
And then check your grades. Go to your grades tab, scroll over and look to see, the class we're in, which is 119 kinesiology. It'll be labeled. And you'll see 1, 2, midterm, 3, 4, and then final.
Got it. Cool.
Any questions about the anatomy today? Thomas, Robert, Thomas, Mir?
No, it's
all good.
A lot of information, but no questions.
Yeah.
It's a big one.
Those flashcards will probably come in handy right now, right?
Like I said, I cannot make you make flashcards, but I can highly incentivize you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a good idea, dude, or if you have somebody that can sit there and just ask you the word and then, you just talk to them. That way you don't have to kind of look at it. You can just hear it.
Yeah.
Next mod, we'll be looking, we'll mention at the end of this mod as well, but next mod, we'll talk about the overhead squat. And we'll spend so much time looking at that. That's another one that's super handy for flashcards.
You said overhead squat?
Yeah, it's an assessment that we do. And it's
you hold something in squat?
No, you just take your arms overhead.
Oh, okay.
But you will look at it and you go, okay, the knees cave in. That means, and it's a list of 5 or 6 muscles.
Yeah.
That's another very handy flashcard thing.
And that could help fix you getting different things. You fix all those 5 things in that one assessment, huh?
Yeah, because you just want to be able to pull that stuff off the top of your head. When someone's
right.
I have this pain here, what does that mean? Right? If someone says I got pain on the outside of my knee, they're probably describing runner's knee. So now you're going to go, okay, well, what muscles attached to the outside of the knee? Biceps femoris, short head, TFL and IT band for sure. Those are that's the big one. And then vastus lateralis. So you're I'm going to look at those 3 muscles. Let's see if we can massage those 3, foam roll them. And now let's do a stretch for all 3 of those. How's the pain on the outside of the knee? And they're way better. Oh, also peroneals. So that's why this, anatomy is kind of important. We kind of look at what they're doing and we look for what's tight.
Cool.
All right, fellas, let me kill the recording here.
Oh,